When an influential TV host tried to embarrass Donald Trump, he thought he had set the perfect trap. But just a few minutes later, it became clear that this would be the biggest mistake of his career. In front of millions of viewers, Trump turned the tables, forcing his opponent to defend himself. And here's what happened next. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and millions of viewers across the country were tuned in. Tonight's special guest was none other than Donald Trump, and sitting across from him was the infamous journalist Richard Blake, a seasoned political commentator known for his aggressive and often confrontational interview style. Blake had built his career on putting high-profile conservatives on the defensive, and tonight, he believed, would be no different. Blake's research team had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They had meticulously crafted questions designed to corner Trump, to make him stumble, and to extract soundbites that could dominate headlines for weeks. But what Blake didn't realize was that he wasn't dealing with just any politician. He was up against a man who had spent decades navigating high-pressure business deals, presidential debates, and relentless media attacks. Trump wasn't just prepared. He was ready to turn the tables in a way that would leave the host scrambling for control. As the countdown to airtime began, Trump sat comfortably in his chair, exuding the confidence that had become his trademark. He adjusted his tie, nodded to the producers, and watched as Blake took a deep breath before facing the cameras. A sleek voiceover introduced the show, the lights brightened, and the program went live. "Good evening, America," Blake began, flashing his signature practice smile. "Tonight, we are honored to be joined by a man who needs no introduction, former President Donald Trump." He turned towards Trump, his eyes glinting with the anticipation of the confrontation to come. "Mr. Trump, thank you for being here." Trump nodded. "Happy to be here, Richard. Always a pleasure." Blake wasted no time. "Let's get right to it. You've built an empire, influenced millions, and even served as President of the United States. But there are those who argue that your success is a result of privilege and luck, rather than sheer hard work. What do you say to those critics?" Trump smirked slightly. "You know, Richard, that's an interesting question. Liberals love that word, luck. It's what they say when they want to diminish hard work, discipline, and vision. But let me tell you something. Luck didn't build skyscrapers, luck didn't create jobs, and luck certainly didn't make America great again." Blake's smile tightened. He had hoped for a defensive reaction, but instead, Trump had taken control of the narrative. Still, he pressed forward. "So you're saying that everything you've achieved is purely through hard work?" "I'm saying that success comes to those who earn it," Trump replied, his voice steady. "Yes, I've been fortunate in some ways, but I've also worked harder than most people can imagine. I've dealt with challenges that would break others. The key difference is I never backed down." He leaned in slightly. "But Richard, let's be honest. This isn't about my work ethic, is it? You brought me here for something else?" Blake feigned innocence. "Not at all, Mr. Trump. I just think it's important to examine the factors that contribute to success. That brings me to another topic, your family." He leaned back, as if setting the stage for his real attack. "You often credit your family, particularly your wife, Melania, as an important part of your life. But many people feel that she's been largely silent, almost invisible, compared to other high-profile political spouses. Don't you think the public deserves to know more about the woman behind Donald Trump?" Trump's expression didn't waver. If anything, his gaze sharpened. "The public knows exactly what they need to know about Melania. She's brilliant, accomplished, and carries herself with dignity. Unlike some, she doesn't feel the need to fill every silence with noise." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the audience. Blake saw the shift and decided to push harder. "But Mr. Trump, there are those who question her achievements. Some say that her greatest accomplishment is simply being Mrs. Trump. What do you say to that?" For the first time, Trump's expression darkened. "Let me be very clear about something, Richard. Melania speaks 5 languages fluently. She's built a successful career of her own. She's represented this country with more grace and class than many so-called political wives. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because the mainstream media is too busy pushing their own narrative." Blake shifted in his chair. "Of course, Mr. Trump. But don't you think being married to you has opened certain doors for her?" Trump chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You know what's interesting about that question? It tells me exactly what's wrong with the way people like you think. Success isn't about doors being opened. It's about what you do once you're in the room. And let me tell you something, Melania doesn't just walk into rooms. She transforms them. A ripple of applause spread through the studio. Blake's composure faltered for a brief moment, but he wasn't ready to back down just yet. He adjusted his notes and prepared for his next move, one that he believed would finally put Trump on the defensive. What he didn't realize was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Blake leaned forward, dropping his voice to a more intimate, almost conspiratorial tone. Mr. Trump, let's be real here. You're a man of power, wealth, and influence. You could be with any woman you want. Yet, you've stayed with someone who has been alongside you for quite some time. Have you ever considered trading up? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The air grew still. The audience collectively held its breath. Even the cameramen exchanged quick glances. Trump sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was lower, calmer, and infinitely more dangerous, he repeated the question. Trading up? Blake hesitated. He had anticipated anger, maybe a flustered response. But this was something else entirely. Trump leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Blake's. Let me tell you something about value, Richard. In business, sure, sometimes you trade up. A better deal, a newer model, a shinier option. But we're not talking about real estate or cars here. We're talking about my wife, my partner, the mother of my son. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even Blake's producers, watching from behind the cameras, were frantically signaling. But he was frozen in place, caught in the intensity of the moment. Trump continued, his voice now carrying the weight of someone who was not just defending his marriage, but delivering a lesson to everyone watching. Real value, Richard, isn't about who looks the best in a magazine or who fits some shallow idea of perfection. Real value is someone who stands by you when the cameras are off, when the world is against you, when the easy choice would be to walk away. Real value is loyalty, integrity, and character. Things that clearly aren't taught in journalism school anymore. Blake's face was pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Trump sat back in his chair, letting the moment sink in. Now tell me, Richard, he said, his voice lighter, but no less commanding. Do you have any real questions? Or was this just an audition for a gossip column? The studio erupted in applause. And just like that, Richard Blake realized he had lost control of the interview. And worse, the entire country was watching. The studio remained eerily silent after Trump's commanding response. Richard Blake, the once confident host, sat frozen in his chair, his carefully rehearsed strategy crumbling before him. He had come prepared with a battle plan. Yet now he found himself the one on the defensive, facing an opponent who not only refused to be rattled but had completely turned the tables. But Blake wasn't ready to concede defeat just yet. Clearing his throat, he forced a smile, though the edges of his confidence had begun to fray. Mr. Trump, I appreciate your passionate defense of your marriage. But let's step back from personal matters for a moment and talk about a broader issue. Some argue that your perspective on family values is outdated in today's progressive society. How do you respond to critics who say that the traditional values you champion no longer reflect modern America? Trump leaned back slightly, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. You see, Richard, that's the thing about modern America. People like you love to talk about how things have changed, how values should evolve. But let me ask you something. Has integrity changed? Has loyalty changed? Have love and commitment suddenly become outdated concepts? Or is it just that some people don't like being reminded of what real values actually look like? The audience stirred. It was clear Trump wasn't just answering the question. He was making a statement. And the impact was undeniable. Blake hesitated, but he pushed forward. Mr. Trump, I think what many people are saying is that times have changed. More households today have different dynamics, different structures. Wouldn't you agree that society should adapt? Trump nodded, his tone even but unwavering. Adaptation is a good thing, Richard. Progress is a good thing. But let's be very clear. Progress doesn't mean throwing away the foundations that make us strong. Family, commitment, respect, these aren't relics of the past. They're the very things that hold a society together. And when you start telling people that those things don't matter anymore, that's when you see the cracks forming. Blake exhaled slowly. The conversation was slipping from his grasp, but he wasn't ready to back down. He adjusted his posture and flipped to a new page in his notes, scanning for another line of attack. All right, Mr. Trump, let's shift gears a little. Since we're discussing values, let's talk about leadership. You have been one of the most polarizing figures in modern politics. Some say you are a fighter for the people. Others say you are divisive. Would you say your leadership style aligns with the very values you're defending? Trump chuckled. Richard, let me tell you something. Leadership isn't about making everyone happy. If you're making everyone happy, you're not leading, you're pandering. My job isn't to make everyone feel comfortable. My job is to do what's right. And if standing up for American values, for hard work, for accountability makes me polarizing, then so be it. Because at the end of the day, the people who get things done are the ones willing to stand firm, not the ones who bow down when the pressure is on. Blake's fingers tapped against the desk. His control over the interview was slipping further and further. He could see it in the faces of the audience, in the way the energy in the room had shifted. Trump wasn't just answering questions. He was shaping the narrative. Desperate for a shift, Blake leaned in slightly. Mr. Trump, let's address something that has come up repeatedly in public discourse. Your critics argue that your leadership style relies heavily on confrontation rather than unity. How do you respond to those who say you should strive for more bipartisanship and cooperation? Trump didn't hesitate. Richard, let's talk about what unity really means. To some people, unity is just another word for do as we say. They don't want cooperation, they want compliance. And I'll tell you right now, I don't play that game. Real leadership means standing by your principles, even when it's not popular. It means having the courage to make tough decisions, even when people push back. That's not division. That's strength. And the people who get things done in this world aren't the ones who try to please everyone. They're the ones who get up every day and fight for what's right. The crowd in the studio began to murmur, a few nodding along, others whispering to their neighbors. Even those who had entered the room skeptical of Trump's views couldn't deny the force of his words. Blake knew he had to regain control. He glanced at the teleprompter, looking for a new angle. And then he found it his last chance to put Trump on the defensive. Mr. Trump, you talk about values, leadership, and strength. But let's address something personal. You've had multiple marriages. How do you reconcile your stance on traditional family values with your own personal history? Isn't there a contradiction there? For a brief second, there was silence. Blake thought he had him. Then Trump leaned forward, his expression unreadable. That's a fair question, Richard, and I'll answer it directly. I've made mistakes. I'm not perfect. But you know what I have done? I've learned. I've never pretended to be something I'm not. I don't preach perfection. I preach values. And values aren't about pretending to be flawless. They're about striving to be better, to do better every single day. Blake blinked. That was not the response he had anticipated. Trump continued. You want to talk about contradictions? Let's talk about people who claim to champion progress, but silence anyone who disagrees with them. Let's talk about the media that claims to be objective but pushes one-sided narratives. Let's talk about politicians who promise the world and deliver nothing. That's the real contradiction, Richard. Not a man who has made mistakes and owned up to them, but a system that lies to the American people every single day. The studio erupted into applause. Even some of Blake's producers exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing something they hadn't planned for. Blake's composure was now visibly shaken. He fumbled with his notes, struggling to find a way to salvage the conversation. But deep down, he knew it was over. Trump adjusted his tie, his expression calm. Any more questions, Richard? Or would you like me to start asking some? The audience chuckled. And for the first time in his career, Richard Blake found himself at a complete loss for words. What was supposed to be a takedown had turned into a masterclass in turning the tables. And the entire country was watching. Richard Blake struggled to regain his composure. The energy in the room had shifted entirely, and he knew it. What was meant to be an interview designed to corner Trump had transformed into a showcase of his unshakable confidence and ability to flip any narrative. Blake's producers were frantically feeding him instructions through his earpiece. urging him to regain control of the interview. But how? Every attempt to undermine Trump had backfired, making the host seem like an antagonist rather than an objective journalist. Blake inhaled deeply, forcing himself to maintain his polished demeanor. All right, Mr. Trump, let's pivot a bit. You've been incredibly vocal about the role of the media in shaping public opinion. Some argue that your criticism of the press is dangerous, that it undermines public trust in journalism. Do you worry that your rhetoric contributes to the growing divide in this country? Trump sat back, his expression unreadable for a moment before he smirked slightly. You know, Richard, it's funny how the media loves to talk about dangerous rhetoric when it's someone calling them out. But let's talk about real danger. Real danger is a media that doesn't tell the truth. Real danger is journalists who claim to be neutral but push one-sided narratives. Real danger is when the press sees itself as an activist group rather than a source of information. That's what's truly dividing this country. Blake shifted in his chair, sensing the growing approval from the audience. But Mr. Trump, don't you think a free press is essential to democracy? Absolutely, Trump replied smoothly. But a free press is supposed to be fair, Richard, not a weapon used by one political side against the other. The problem isn't that we have a free press. The problem is we have a corrupt press. A press that manipulates facts, that selectively edits interviews, that ignores stories that don't fit their agenda. And when someone calls them out, suddenly they're the victims. Give me a break. A few audience members clapped. Blake knew he was losing control again. He needed to shift tactics fast. Let's move to another topic then, Blake said, glancing at his notes. Your stance on immigration has been one of the most controversial aspects of your presidency. Some say your policies were harsh, even cruel. Looking back, do you have any regrets about how you handled immigration reform? Trump's expression didn't change. Regrets? No, because my job as president was to protect the American people. And protecting the American people means securing our borders. It means making sure that immigration happens legally. Look, Richard, every country in the world protects its borders. But the moment I said America should do the same, suddenly it was controversial? That's nonsense. Blake pressed on, determined to regain some ground. But critics argue that families were separated, that people suffered under your policies. Do you not acknowledge the human cost of these measures? Trump exhaled slowly, then leaned forward. Let me ask you something, Richard. Where was this outrage when previous administrations enforced similar policies? Where was this outrage when children were being trafficked across the border by cartels, when drugs were pouring into our communities? I took action to fix these problems, and suddenly I'm the bad guy? The truth is, the media only cares when it fits their narrative. And I'll tell you right now, America sees through it. Blake felt the weight of Trump's words settle over the room. He could see it in the faces of the audience, some nodding in agreement, others simply absorbed in the sheer force of Trump's conviction. Blake had walked into this interview thinking he could control the narrative. Instead, he was watching it unravel before his eyes. Blake tried once more. Mr. Trump, I think we can agree that immigration is a complex issue. But let's talk about something that affects every American: economic policies. You often claim that your administration was responsible for one of the strongest economies in modern history. Yet some economists argue that the foundation for that success was laid before your presidency. How do you respond to that? Trump chuckled. Oh, I love this one. So, when the economy was booming under my administration, it was because of my predecessor? But when things started falling apart, it was all my fault. That's convenient, isn't it? Look, here are the facts. Under my administration, we had record low unemployment, rising wages, and historic job growth. We cut taxes, we slashed regulations, and we put America first. That wasn't luck, Richard. That was leadership. Blake adjusted his tie, frustration creeping into his expression. So you take full credit for the economic growth during your presidency? I take credit for the policies that made it happen, Trump shot back. The people deserve to know the truth. And the truth is, we had an incredible economy because we focused on American businesses, American workers, and American industries. And let me tell you, people remember that. Blake clenched his jaw slightly. He could feel the time slipping away, the control of the interview dissolving before his eyes. He had one last shot, one final attempt to put Trump on the defensive. One last question, Mr. Trump, Blake said, leaning in. There are those who say that your time in politics has left the country more divided than ever. If you had the chance to do it all over again, would you change anything? Trump paused for a brief moment, then spoke with absolute certainty. Richard, the country isn't divided because of me. It's divided because we have a political class that cares more about power than the people they serve. It's divided because the media fuels outrage instead of reporting facts. It's divided because too many people are afraid to stand up for what they believe in. Would I change anything? Maybe. But the one thing I wouldn't change? Fighting for the American people. And that's exactly what I'll keep doing. The studio fell silent for a moment. Then, a wave of applause erupted, the audience reacting to the sheer force of Trump's words. Blake sat there, stunned, realizing that the interview he had hoped would expose Trump had instead solidified his dominance. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the moment that would be dissected and replayed across the country. Blake, knowing he had no more moves left, forced a smile. Well, Mr. Trump, thank you for your time. Trump smiled back. Always a pleasure, Richard. Let me know if you ever want to do a real interview. The program cut to commercial, but the damage was done. The headlines would tell the story soon enough. Trump had not just survived the interview. He had won it, and the whole world had watched it happen. As the commercial break ended and the program resumed, Richard Blake sat upright in his chair, trying to project the same air of confidence he had at the start of the interview. But the truth was, he had lost control of the narrative. Donald Trump sat across from him, relaxed, composed, and completely unfazed. He had turned every attempt at entrapment into an opportunity to showcase his unwavering confidence. Now, as the cameras rolled once more, Blake knew he had to find a way to regain his footing. Blake cleared his throat and leaned forward. Mr. Trump, let's move into another area that has been heavily debated in recent years, foreign policy. Your administration took a highly unconventional approach to diplomacy, particularly with world leaders often considered adversaries. Some say your approach was reckless, dealing with authoritarian figures, alienating allies. Looking back, do you believe your foreign policy strengthened America's position on the world stage? Trump smirked, folding his hands on the table. Absolutely. And let me tell you why. You see, Richard, a lot of politicians before me liked to talk tough, but when it came time to act, they were weak. My approach wasn't reckless. It was strong. When I talked to world leaders, they knew I meant business. I wasn't going to bow to anyone. And guess what? They respected that. Blake raised an eyebrow. But your critics argue that by engaging with leaders like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, you legitimize regimes that are widely condemned for human rights abuses. Do you believe that sitting down with them was the right call? Trump leaned back slightly. Richard, let me ask you something. When you're negotiating a business deal, do you refuse to talk to the other side? No, you don't. You sit down, you talk, and you get results. The same applies to foreign policy. If we refuse to talk to people just because we don't agree with them, nothing changes. The previous administrations ignored North Korea for years, and what happened? The situation got worse. I sat down with Kim Jong-un, and for the first time in decades, we had serious negotiations. Was he a tough guy? Sure. But that's why you need a leader who can handle tough situations. Blake exhaled, sensing Trump was once again shaping the narrative in his favor. Still, Mr. Trump, many say that your America First policy alienated allies and weakened international coalitions. Do you not think that prioritizing national interests came at the expense of global partnerships? Trump shook his head. No, Richard, and that's the problem with how people think these days. Putting America first doesn't mean abandoning our allies. It means making sure that our deals are fair. Look at NATO. Before I came into office, the United States was paying billions more than other countries. I told them they had to pay their fair share. And guess what? They did. For the first time in years, NATO countries increased their contributions because they knew I wasn't playing around. That's not alienation. That's leadership. The audience murmured in agreement. Blake glanced toward his producers, who were furiously typing away, likely reshaping the talking points for the next segment. He decided to switch gears. Let's talk about domestic affairs, Mr. Trump. During your presidency, there were numerous protests and significant social unrest, with many Americans feeling the country was more divided than ever. Do you believe your rhetoric played a role in that division? Trump's expression didn't waver. Richard, let's be real. The media loves to talk about division, but they never talk about who's actually fueling it. Was I out there encouraging riots? No. But you know who was? Certain politicians who refused to take action when cities were being destroyed. The media ran cover for them, called it mostly peaceful protests while buildings were burning behind them. Meanwhile, I was calling for law and order, for safety. And I'll tell you, most Americans agreed with me. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. So you don't believe you contributed to the national divide in any way? Trump shook his head. What I did was tell the truth. And sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable. But I'll take that over lies any day. The problem isn't that I divided the country. The problem is that people don't like hearing the truth when it doesn't fit their narrative. Blake took a deep breath. His attempts to shake Trump's confidence had failed. The audience, many of whom had started the interview skeptically, were now nodding along with Trump's responses. Blake had one last chance to try to turn the tide. Mr. Trump, as we approach the next election cycle, there are many who say your time in politics is over. Some argue that the country needs a new direction. Do you believe America still wants you as its leader? Trump smiled. Richard, let me tell you something. America knows who gets results. And results speak louder than media narratives. We had a booming economy, strong borders, energy independence, and respect on the world stage. And Americans remember that. So to answer your question, yes, they want leadership that works. And if that means me, then so be it. The studio fell silent for a beat before another wave of applause erupted. Blake looked visibly deflated, realizing that once again, Trump had not only survived the interview, but had dominated it. The show's producers frantically signaled for the final segment. Blake forced a smile, knowing full well that history was being made before his eyes. The only question now was how the media would try to spin it. As the final segment of the interview began, Richard Blake took a deep breath, knowing this was his last opportunity to regain control. The night had not gone as planned. What was meant to be an expose had turned into a showcase of Donald Trump's unwavering confidence and command of the narrative. The audience was no longer skeptical. They were engaged, nodding along to Trump's responses, applauding in moments that were never supposed to be in his favor. Blake adjusted his notes, determined to try one last angle. Mr. Trump, we've discussed your policies, your leadership style, and your vision for America. But let's address something that many of your critics say is your biggest flaw, your temperament. Some argue that your approach to leadership is too confrontational, that you are divisive rather than unifying. How do you respond to those who say America needs a leader who can bring people together rather than fuel division? Trump leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but firm. Richard, you know what I find interesting? The people who say I'm divisive are the same ones who spent years attacking me, my family, and my supporters. They're the ones who divided the country by calling millions of Americans deplorables, by pushing narratives that anyone who disagrees with them is dangerous. The truth is, they don't want unity. They want submission. And I'll tell you right now, I'm not in the business of bowing down. I'm in the business of getting results. Blake pressed on. But surely you can acknowledge that words matter, that a leader's tone sets the tone for the country. Do you regret any of the rhetoric you've used over the years? Trump smirked. You know, people love to talk about my tone, but they never talk about results. Did my tone rebuild the economy? No, my policies did. Did my tone secure the border? No, my actions did. Did my tone make America energy independent? No, my leadership did. So no, Richard, I don't regret speaking the truth. If anything, I regret that more people in politics don't have the courage to do the same. The audience responded with another round of applause. Blake exhaled, feeling the moment slipping away yet again. He had one final question, one last attempt to challenge Trump in a way that might salvage his own reputation from the disaster unfolding on live television. Mr. Trump, Blake said, straightening in his chair, we're living in uncertain times. Many Americans feel anxious about the future, divided over politics, frustrated with the economy, worried about the direction of the country. If you had to leave them with one message tonight, one final thought, what would it be? Trump looked directly into the camera, his voice steady, his expression serious. My message is simple. America is the greatest country in the world, but it's only as strong as the people who fight for it. We cannot let fear, division, and corruption take away everything we've built. We need leaders who put America first, who fight for the hardworking men and women of this country, who refuse to let political games and media manipulation dictate our future. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. And I'll tell you this, if you love this country, if you believe in its potential, if you want a future where America stands strong, then it's time to stand up. Speak the truth. Demand accountability. And never, ever let anyone tell you that loving your country is a bad thing. Because at the end of the day, real leadership isn't about being popular. It's about doing what's right. And I will always fight for what's right. The studio erupted into applause, louder than any reaction throughout the night. Blake sat still, momentarily speechless. The producers, sensing the energy in the room, quickly signaled to wrap up the show. Blake forced a professional smile. "Mr. Trump, thank you for joining us tonight." Trump smiled back. "Always a pleasure, Richard. Let me know when you want to have a real debate." As the credits rolled, the audience remained engaged, many standing and continuing to applaud. The moment had already gone viral. Within minutes, clips of the interview flooded social media, with people dissecting every moment, every exchange, every reaction. By the time Blake left the studio that night, he knew the truth. This wasn't just another interview. This was a defining moment, and whether he liked it or not, history would remember this night not for the questions he asked, but for the way Trump had answered them.